Hi, I'm Annika Vogt, co-curator of the current group exhibition, A Winter's Tale, on display within the windows of the Athens Cultural Center. A Winter's Tale harkens back to days old, when a well-told tale had the power to ignite imagination and wonder. This exhibition features Hudson Valley, New York-based artists Iria Bodien, Jenny Getty, Ellen Menzies, Danielle Norris, and Christine Feaster, whose works explore storytelling through the lens of both fairy tale and newly constructed narratives. A Winter's Tale is on display December 5th, 2020 through January 17th, 2021, and the Athens Cultural Center is located at 24 2nd Street in Athens, New York. Now, without further ado, the Athens Cultural Center and Dr. Evarts Library is pleased to present this video series examining Hudson Valley lore with A Winter's Tale co-curator Amanda Lees and Greene County historian Jonathan Palmer. We hope you enjoy and thank you for watching.
Hey there, my name is Jonathan Palmer. I'm the village historian for Athens, New York, and we're standing at Murderers Creek today, which is the site in 1813 of the murder of Sally Hamilton, who was a young woman who lived in the village here. And I wanted to break down a little bit of the legend today, retell it on camera as I know it, being a resident of the village. And maybe, hopefully, we'll spend some time later on breaking down a little bit of what this legend is and what it means to the community and what it represents about us as the people who carry that story on. So, the legend of Sally Hamilton, which begins in 1813, takes place in a village newly named the Village of Athens. It had only been called that for 7 or 8 years at that point. And this young woman, Sally, was the daughter of a magistrate in town by the name of Samuel Hamilton. She was essentially one of the first daughters of the village. Very affluent family, well-connected. Her in-laws were, some of the founding members of the community here. And on an August night in 1813, she was walking home from the upper village, having visited with some members of her family and some friends. And as she walked home that night, she met with a couple people on the road. They spoke with her, and about, as they describe it in the transcript, 20 rods from her house, her last friend departed to head home, and she walked on alone to her parents. And she was never seen again, alive, that is. A couple days later, having realized the next morning that Sally was missing, the village mobilized itself to go out and search for her. And the search culminated here along Murderers Creek. Now, there's a bridge just a little ways up from us, which is a little downstream from where the original bridge on the Albany and Greene Turnpike was. But by that bridge, searchers discovered blood stains, and a search party who proceeded up the banks of the creek found her body floating face down a little further upstream. Her body was retrieved, brought back to the village. An examination was performed. It was very clear that she had been killed. There was malicious intent. And any number of things were conjectured about why or how this had happened. It took us several years, actually, after Sally's death to actually begin to identify and put on trial individuals who were potentially the perpetrators of the crime of her murder. The first man who was tried for the crime was a gentleman by the name of Patrick Kavanaugh, who was actually acquitted after it was determined he was probably insane, even though he had some facts about the crime that weren't generally known that seemed to indicate that he might have been the perpetrator. The most famous trial related to the murder of this young woman happens in 1817, and it's carried in newspapers across the state of New York. It was the trial of Sickler and Lent, and I'm going to forget the name, the first name of both of the gentlemen, but Essentially, Sickler and Lent, they were two members of, it was a New York State militia or something similar. They had enlisted up in Saratoga. They were at a barracks up near Albany and had allegedly deserted. In the explanation that they gave for the court in 1817, they give this long rambling account of their travels across this section of the state, eventually arriving in Athens the day of the crime when Sally was killed in 1813. And they give a lengthy account of how they had encountered her on the road that night. They had accosted her near her house, beaten her, dragged her back up here to the bridge, killed her, and thrown her into the water. There were a number of people who, based on the evidence they provided at that time, who determined that it was likely that Sickler and Lent were the guys who actually did this. But because of a number of different testimonies that were given by other people who were familiar with these two individuals, Sickler and Lent ended up being acquitted. And Sally Hamilton's murder remained unsolved, and it still remains unsolved, which is part of the mystique that kind of draws people back to this story. It's this, you know, you have this young woman who is beset by this tragedy. She's killed. They find her body, and for 200 years, the story of this unsolved murder has persisted. Now, there's, of course, with an unsolved murder like that, a very obvious scene of the crime. Invariably, the tale gets twisted, and you start seeing versions of this. I recently read one that appeared in the 1940s in a local newspaper about how a woman in white, allegedly Sally Hamilton, is seen at the bridge. And of course, if you ask any local today where Murderers Creek got its name, invariably they will explain to you that the name Murderers Creek is related to the 1813 murder of Sally Hamilton. As a local kid, I heard the story maybe 2 or 3 different ways, all the same variation. The young woman is killed, her body is dumped, and either they find her directly underneath the bridge, or they find her floating, or they never find her body and the murder goes unsolved. And it always progresses into a whodunit. And, you know, the question remains, of course, you know, why is it that this story, which is so obviously factually based and so incredibly tragic, why is it that people in town want to keep revisiting this and dwelling on it and recovering this kind of open wound that we have as a community here?
Hi, my name is Amanda Lees, and I'm one of the co-curators of A Winter's Tale at the Athens Cultural Center here in lovely Athens, New York.
And we're standing now next to the grave of Sally Hamilton in the middle of the old Episcopal burying ground at the back of Mount Hope Cemetery in Athens. In a previous segment, we talked about the legend of Sally Hamilton, and Amanda has some questions that might help fill in any viewers, you know, and flush a little more information out from me about the legend itself and the circumstances of it.
Yeah, I mean, as always with an unsolved mystery, there's a lot of questions to be had for generations after. And first and foremost, I guess I want to get a little bit of a picture. What was Athens like then? Can you tell me more about that? Was it a lot of affluent families and large homes? Was it mostly working class, or was it a mixture of both?
So, at the time of Sally Hamilton's murder, the village of Athens was something akin to like a boom town in the West, as you'd think of it in an old Western film. I mean, the buildings were made of brick and not wood, but the village was literally brand new at the time. Only within the last 20 years had affluent New Englanders and investors from the other side of the river and up-and-coming entrepreneurs from this area really gathered together to create a new planned community on the shores of the Hudson, soon to be called the village of Athens. So when Sally Hamilton is murdered, the village is made up of everybody from, you know, the working class communities who are working docks, they're boatmen working on the river in brickyards, we have artisans and craftsmen, and we have this kind of investor class whose Sally's father is a part of, more or less. The people who are bringing capital to this new community, they're bringing fresh ideas, and, you know, they're most importantly inserting themselves as the people involved with the governance of the community as well. You know, these are important people, but you get a perfect cross-section of what the young republic was in 1810 when you look at Athens at this time.
Cool. And had there been a crime like Sally Hamilton's murder in Athens before, or was this a shock to the community not only because of how grisly of a crime it was, but because there'd been nothing like it before?
It was really kind of unprecedented. The community was so young that it didn't have a tradition of, you know, real joys and real sorrows, you know, prior to that, you know. Before the Revolution, Athens was a farming community made up of a couple scattered houses and farm fields, and the residents, these older Dutch families, you know, they were all interrelated and done business with each other literally for generations at that time. So this new community that's here is new in so many ways. They're not related to the old guard, these old Dutch families. And for one of their, you know, bright young daughters of this new place to fall victim to such a heinous crime was incredibly traumatic. And I think that's why it persists in some ways.
Oh, definitely. I mean, to this day, it's terrifying to be a girl walking home alone at night, right? That's probably why we remember this tale for so many generations, and of course, it being unsolved. And I want to ask about, in the ways that the story broke out and was reported, were there a lot of discrepancies as it was told? Did it get, often how cases do today, did it get blown up in media and these untrue facts added and things like that? How did it morph as the media of the time got a hold of it?
You know, and the media of the time is slow moving in so many ways. You know, newspapers are relying on the passing along of either print copies of documents or handwritten testimonials that they're then publishing. But because of the nature of the crime, there's actually a lot of veracity in all of the accounts as they're spread around. You know, they want to get these facts straight. There's almost an air of, you know, there's like a requirement that the reporting on it be truthful, so people are aware of the facts at the time. They want to help find the killer. The more people you make aware, the more likely you might arrive at some sort of conclusion about the circumstances. So the reporting at the time is pretty consistent. What's inconsistent is the ability of the residents here to arrive at a conclusion about who did it. And the case lingers for years. I mean, the Sickler and Lent, the guys who a lot of people think probably did it, who knows, they aren't put on trial until 1817. It's 5 years after the murder happened. I mean, that's an insanely long time to, you know, bring somebody to trial for a crime of this nature. And by that time, you know, Sally was long in the ground and the village was trying to move on, and this thing was already almost like a ghost following them. You know, this trial that just couldn't be resolved. And it wasn't, even after 1817.
Wow. Are there any facts in the way that the story is told today commonly that are untrue? I know that I've read some places that her murder is why Murderer's Creek is called such, but that's incorrect, right?
Yeah, so Murderer's Creek was called Murderer's Creek before 1813, before Sally Hamilton was killed. And, you know, I've seen maps from the 1750s that give the name Murderer's Creek written on it, next to the hamlet of Lunenburg, you know, when Athens was still called that. And it's probable that murderer is a bastardization of an older Dutch name for the creek. It was probably something like Motorig Kill or Muddy Creek or something like that. Okay. And you know, if you have a bunch of Englishmen new to a region with a linguistic barrier already in place between them and their Dutch counterparts living in the same place, they're trying to use place names interchangeably, but invariably you end up with these errors in translation. You end up with Murderer's Creek where it was Muddy Creek in the Dutch language at one time. You know, that's a conjecture, but I can back it up with some evidence. But
nice.
You know, the telling of the legend itself kind of gets conflated in weird ways. There's an account again, from an Athens newspaper in the 1940s, where they talk about how not only was Sally Hamilton killed there, but a woman named Mary Duncan was killed and buried at the bridge in the 1840s.
Oh, wow.
And you have to begin to unpack this. It's like, wow, okay, who's this other woman all of a sudden that's being inserted into the story? I don't know if there was actually another murder at the creek. You know, Athens it's a rough and tumble riverfront town in some ways. Bad things happen, you know, down by the docks. You have transient people moving by boat. You have, you know, this class tension as well there. You know, I don't know if that story has any veracity, but it's weird that they would place another heinous crime at the site of Sally Hamilton's death. And they talk about them as two distinct things occurring at that one place. And they talk about there being this one ghost, though. It's almost like the idea of the murderer is the ghost.
Yeah.
You know, it's strange.
Well, that's often what ghosts become, right? Or kind of placeholders, or things that are unresolved become ghosts, right? Yeah. Whether or not it's an actual haunted apparition or just a lingering memory of something that's unresolved.
Yeah.
Do you have any theories about who Sally Hamilton's killer might have been?
I don't have a theory, but Moses Cantine, who was the district attorney, and the judge who tried the case, whose name escapes me at the moment, both were under the impression that it was probably Sickler who did it. Lent ended up in prison after the trial because he was convicted of perjury. They say that Lent perjured himself when he gave his testimony at this murder trial against Sickler, his counterpart. And when Lent was in prison, there are even accounts that say that Lent maintained his innocence of perjury throughout his time in jail. And that's pretty bizarre, because, you know, you maintain your innocence of perjury because you were an accomplice in a murder. So he's saying the murder absolutely happened.
Yeah.
I am not guilty of lying in court.
Wow.
You know, and that tells you a little bit too about, you know, what the values of the community, you know, what the values of these people who are participating. I mean, this is even a new court system that they're a part of.
Wow.
They believe that the burden above all else, when you swore on that Bible, you were swearing to tell the truth, and he gave his truth as he knew it. So, you know, if the lawyer, the judge, and one of the people who tried for the crime all said they did it, I'm inclined to think they did it.
Yeah. Wow. Hey, maybe we'll never know. John, thank you so much. This has been lovely.
Just to conclude, you know, what it is about the legend of Sally Hamilton, why it persists. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, because even, you know, as a kid growing up here, knowing adults who continued this oral tradition of this story, people who kind of carried it with them and would speak of it as something that made them in the know about the village of Athens, why is it that we keep returning to it? And, you know, I wonder, as a legend, if it doesn't function in some way to remind us of our guilt as a community about this murder. You know, at the time of her death, there's no way that the community didn't feel some guilt about not somehow having been there to prevent this thing from happening. You know, there were people who testified in the trial that they had heard screams that night and hadn't gone out to investigate. And you think these people who carry that guilt with them for the rest of their lives, that in that moment they didn't walk out of their door. You know, the continuation of this legend and the story of Sally's ghost still haunting the bridge by the creek is a way to remind us of how we failed in that one moment, I think. And that ghost that we have is a ghost that we're always going to have to carry with us in some way. You know, so when you walk through the cemetery here, buried all around Sally are all the people who, you know, they knew her, they were affiliated with her family in some way, they were the people who didn't come that night, and they rest here now surrounding, you know, one of the things that they couldn't step up to the plate and solve during their lifetimes. And this ghost remains with us today, who are, in so many cases, their descendants still, carrying this story on for them.